Man, there are some weird shenanigans going on with some of the Game Awards nominees for Game of the Year. In my last video, I talked about how the PEGI ratings board gave Balatro an 18+ rating, claiming that the game contains gambling just because it has a poker motif, even though it has no gambling whatsoever. Meanwhile, they're giving games like, FIFA a rating of, anyone above the age of 3 can play it, even though that has literal loot boxes, aka literal gambling. And then I also talked about this speech that Larian Boss and Baldur's Gate 3 dev and head Swen gave during Game Awards 2024, where he basically called out the entire games industry, talking about what makes a game of the year and just all the integrity that goes behind a game that's made with the right intentions, made from a place of pure passion and not with the intention to purely monetize and focused on financials and whatnot. It was a great speech, honestly, that I think highlights the kind of morals and ideals that more companies should take with them to be able to kind of become etched in the history of gaming as a paragon of gaming, something to be remembered for all time. So that speech actually comes into play in today's video and today's story because it had some weird shenanigans happen when it comes to Black Myth Wukong, which is one of the nominees for Game of the Year 2024. Obviously, it didn't win. The winner this year was Astrobot. Black Myth Wukong, though, was nominated, which is by itself a big deal. But fans of Black Myth Wukong, in particular Chinese players, were not a fan of the fact that Black Myth Wukong didn't win, but also the way Swen presented his speech. And some kind of mistranslation apparently happened that led them to believe that Swen is being some kind of hypocrite, which is why you will see that on the day of the Game Awards, or rather the day after, on December 13th, 2024, a decent wave of negative reviews began to flood in, as you can see in this graph. That eventually did die down, but there was this spike of negative reviews from Chinese players. New Salad Multiplayer first got wind of this, and they took some screenshots of all the Chinese gamers who decided to review bomb the game, or I should say tried to review bomb the game, because despite the spike in negative reviews, it still didn't change the review score at all. It is still sitting on an overwhelmingly positive score of 96%, both in recent reviews and all-time reviews. I think the all-time reviews was a little higher before the flood of negative reviews happened for a little bit, but it is still at overwhelmingly positive. This is a game that garnered so many positive reviews that even an attempted review bombing ultimately didn't make that much of a dent or a difference. But you know what does make a difference? Having your personal data being kept private, which brings us to the sponsor of today's video, DeleteMe, a subscription service that is dedicated to keeping your personal information safe by essentially sweeping it off the internet. Data brokers are constantly out there trying to profit off of selling your personal data to nefarious actors, so it is more important than ever to be proactive about your digital footprint, and that's where DeleteMe comes in. With this service, in one fell swoop, you can delete your personal information from search results and hundreds of data broker websites. Everything from your name, age, past and present addresses, photos, email, phone numbers, relatives, social media, occupation, marital status, property value, you name it. Information that could be used in shady ways. I didn't realize just how public my data was until I saw my first report from DeleteMe detailing just how many data broker websites had my personal information. And with how much the volume of personal information being available online has increased, tripled between 2019 and 2023, there's no better time than now to have a service like DeleteMe do a big sweep, especially during the holidays where you just want to not worry about that stuff. I also have the security of knowing that DeleteMe is constantly active, monitoring sites and removing data as needed, and providing privacy reports every 3 months to keep me in the know about all that stuff. You can even make your own custom requests to have your information removed from specific sources by DeleteMe's experts. So if digital privacy is a top priority for you, you can protect your data with DeleteMe by using my link, joindeleteme.com/Yong20 and my code Yong20 to get 20% off at checkout, with family plans available as well. You can also find all of this in the description and comment section below. Anyway, even if the review bombing didn't make a huge dent, you can still see from Multiplayer First's report a bunch of screenshots that highlight all of the negative reviews that flooded in. And the reason behind this apparently is because of a misinterpretation when it comes to what Swen Vincke said during the Game Awards speech before he presented Astrobot as Game of the Year. I think it's a combination of like both Black Myth Wukong not winning and them believing that Swen Vincke said something that they believed was directed at Black Myth Wukong and the director of Black Myth Wukong. So you might recall that Swen Vincke said, it's stupidly simple how to win Game of the Year, but somehow keeps getting lost. Or, how to just make a good game that at least gets nominated. A studio makes a game because they want to make a game they want to play themselves. They created it because it hadn't been created before. They didn't make it to increase market share. They didn't make it to serve the brand. They didn't have to meet arbitrary sales targets or fear getting laid off if they didn't meet those targets. Furthermore, the people in charge forbade them from cramming the game with anything whose only purpose was to increase revenue and didn't serve the game design. They didn't treat their developers like numbers on a spreadsheet. They didn't treat their players as users to exploit. And they didn't make decisions they knew were short-sighted in function of a bonus or politics. They knew that if you put the game and the team first, the revenue will follow. They were driven by idealism and wanted players to have fun, and they realized that if the developers don't have fun, nobody was going to have fun. They understood the value of respect, that if they treated their developers and players well, the same developers and players would forgive them when things didn't go as planned. But above all, they cared about their games because they love games. It's really that simple. Couldn't have put it better myself. Now, there are bits here where he talks about how Game of the Year winners tend to be ones that didn't do it, like they didn't set out to create a game that was, whose primary purpose was making money. It wasn't about cramming stuff whose only purpose was to increase revenue, and it wasn't about, increasing market share or serving the brand. But that got misconstrued as essentially Swen Vincke saying that games shouldn't strive to make a lot of money, games shouldn't strive to sell well. And so Multiplayer First reports here that for many Chinese users, Vincke's pre-award speech, which emphasized creating games not just for profit, was seen as hypocritical, almost as if directed at Game Science's Black Myth Wukong. This backlash, however, appears to stem from a poor translation of Vincke's speech, which led to misunderstandings. The tone and sarcasm in his comments were lost in translation, causing confusion among viewers. Hypocritical in the sense that Baldur's Gate 3 sold really well, so what? That's not a good thing? Is that what you're trying to say, Swen? Like, that's how they interpreted it, when what Swen was saying was that the reason Baldur's Gate 3 sold well, that was just the byproduct of them approaching Baldur's Gate 3 with the right ideals of just making a good-ass game, making their own dream game that could become other people's dream game, and having word-of-mouth spread, and approaching making games from just a place of passion and artistry instead of like thinking about maximizing revenue and approaching every facet of game design from a revenue intended mindset. Because any game that's made with the idea of making money at the forefront just won't be good, because it's not designed to be fun. It's inherently designed to make money, and that's what Swen Vincke is saying. You should avoid that if you want to make games that stand the test of time and that win awards and that become celebrated throughout the rest of gaming history. He's not saying that making money is bad. He's not saying profit is bad. He's not saying that a game selling well is bad. Making a game is expensive. You want games to make money. You want them to sell really well. All he's saying is that the method to do that isn't to think about how to design the game to maximize revenue. Just design a good-ass game and the revenue will just naturally follow, because that idealism is what yields boundary-pushing games that are unique or that take an existing genre and do something just really incredible with it by creating something with just a whole lot of substance, by taking that genre to the next level. That's what Swen Vincke is trying to say. But apparently just something got lost in translation, leading to this spike in negative reviews from Chinese players, which again, Multiplayer First itself recorded here through the various screenshots. And then the whole like drama, if you will, surrounding this whole situation further intensified when Black Myth Wukong's studio CEO wrote essentially like a message. After he didn't win Game of the Year, he decided to put his thoughts out there on Chinese social media website Weibo, where he posted this long, essentially essay here that's 7 parts. And when he did so, the headlines started to look like this. Black Myth Wukong studio CEO wrote Game of the Year acceptance speech 2 years ago, question selection criteria of the Game Awards. Here's another headline. Game Science CEO criticizes the Game Award selection after Black Myth Wukong loss. And the impression that the headlines gave is that the Black Myth Wukong studio CEO is essentially like a sore loser based on what he said in the big piece that he wrote for Weibo. Here is a translation, and some of the bits that stood out to people was stuff like this. The 4 nominations for Black Myth Wukong, Best Action Game, Best Art Direction, Best Game Direction, and Game of the Year are all a first in China. In the end, it won Best Action Game and Player's Voice, and especially Player's Voice, it's very gratifying. I must admit that there are disappointments and regrets. Games nominated this year are all excellent, but I really don't understand the selection criteria for this year's Game of the Year. I came here for nothing, reads this section of the quote. And then the speech for the annual game for the Game Awards was written 2 years ago, but it was not used. Another translation that's making the rounds is this one right here from Reddit. It reads similarly, saying that the 4 nominations were a first for a Chinese game. Ultimately, we took home Best Action Game and Player's Voice, especially winning Player's Voice was gratifying. This translation also highlights how he basically said something along the lines of, I feel like I came all the way to the Game Awards for nothing. In fact, I wrote my Game of the Year acceptance speech 2 years ago, only to never get the chance to deliver it. Now, if you look at the rest of the speech, there are also positive elements that he highlights, how he ultimately wants to make the best games possible, how he hopes that Black Myth Wukong sends a positive message, how, confident he was in the vision of this game, and how grateful he is ultimately for everything. So there are positive elements to all of this, but a lot of people latched on to these specific quotes that made him look like a sore loser, or that didn't see him as being sportsmanlike in celebrating the games that won, and instead complaining that Black Myth Wukong didn't win, and that he went there for nothing because Black Myth Wukong didn't win. And the fact that he wrote his acceptance speech for Game of the Year 2 years ago and didn't get to use that, a lot of people just looked at that as just kind of getting ahead of himself and kind of cocky. And so on top of Chinese Black Myth Wukong players misinterpreting Swen Vincke's speech, and that leading to review bombing Baldur's Gate 3 for a little bit, which again, ultimately, fortunately, didn't have that much of an impact because of how positively the game has been received. Now we got this side of things where it gained a lot of traction with people seeing Game Science's CEO as criticizing the Game Awards and criticizing the fact that, or just being kind of salty about Black Myth Wukong not winning, and how he had a speech prepared 2 years ago that he didn't get to use, and that he went to the Game Awards for nothing because Black Myth Wukong didn't win. That's how that was perceived, and this gained millions of views and tens of thousands of likes, and a lot of people just kind of not being a fan of that kind of attitude. Stuff like, I get it, but be humble. Saying you wrote it 2 years ago is just arrogant, in my opinion, so on and so forth. Those are some of the top comments here. But then others chimed in saying that the tone of what the Game Science CEO, the Black Myth Wukong Developers Studios CEO, wrote was kind of lost in translation, similarly to how Swen Vincke's speech and the tone of that was lost in translation to Chinese audiences. Apparently, what he wrote on Weibo, the way that's being portrayed, is a lot more negative than how it actually comes across to Chinese readers, is what Mizu here, for example, argues, saying that I read the original article in Chinese and the focus isn't on him complaining about losing Game of the Year at all. He said like 2 specific lines about it out of the whole passage, but of course that's all the articles will focus on. I would not call it a rant at all. It's more of a reflection of his thoughts, and it ends on such a positive note. He expressed gratitude for winning Best Action Game and Player's Voice. Then he talked about being disappointed, and in my opinion, he has all the rights to be. Who wouldn't be? In the sense that this could have been the first Chinese game that is so culturally relevant and significant because of the mythology that it tackles to win Game of the Year, and it didn't. And so some kind of disappointment is understandable. This user continues, and yes, he did mention not understanding the criteria for Game of the Year, and that's kind of true for all of us. It has always been ambiguous and cause for a lot of debates. At the end, he talked about how a lot of things like winning awards awards are outside of their control, so all they will focus on is making great games. So again, the whole thing ultimately ends on a positive note. And then this user continues, and I wrote the acceptance speech 2 years ago with context read more like he's thanking players for the confidence and making a joke that I had even more confidence than you guys because, look, I wrote a speech that I didn't get to use. And this user highlights how these specific emojis were used to make it more lighthearted. And if you go to the Weibo post, indeed, that is exactly what he did. And so apparently you're not meant to take the whole I wrote the speech 2 years ago overly seriously. He's not actually salty about not being able to use that speech that he wrote 2 years ago, is apparently the argument that's being made based on how Chinese readers read the tone of this message. The Twitter user arguing for Game Science's CEO finally says that at the end he wrapped it up with the philosophy behind Black Myth Wukong and hoped that it influenced people in a positive way, that the world is beautiful and worth fighting for. This Twitter user further added that Chinese languages lose a lot of context when translated into English, and the tone is often completely lost in translation. And so basically what this individual is trying to say is that Black Myth Wukong CEO is being misrepresented by the headlines that paint him as someone who's just extremely salty and a sore loser. Apparently, if you just read it from a Chinese reader's perspective, it doesn't really come across that way. Though this user does admit that they didn't like the part where he does say that I felt like I came to the award ceremony for nothing. Apparently, this user even had no arguments to make there. And so the fact that that's there might still kind of give off some bits and pieces of maybe there was a bit of a sore loser attitude that did come out of this message. So maybe the message, while it has a lot of positive to it, still wasn't the most graceful way to handle things, or at least this bit wasn't the most graceful thing to put on there, is what could be argued. But at the end of the day, aside from a bit of that expression of disappointment that they didn't get to win, the message apparently is mostly positive and uplifting, and it is argued by Chinese readers that a lot of that was kind of taken out of context, or a lot of headlines focused on these specific quotes whose tone was not properly captured, and so it's kind of deemed to be a bit of like a mistranslation or misadaptation, a lot like how Swen Vincke's speech that is pretty much all positive, and or at the very, it's critical in some ways, but sends a positive message of like, you know, this is how you should be making games, and about just kind of having integrity in making games. How that stuff and you know, about like not making games with the approach of just making it for profit, that was misinterpreted on China's end. And then on another side of things, a lot of peers claimed during a stream that she saw developers crying, like game science developers crying when their game Black Myth Wukong didn't win Game of the Year. That's kind of what she relayed in this video. And that spread far and wide. But then we have somebody else here, Charles Young, was the former editor-in-chief of IGN China. This individual retweeted this clip and essentially argued against what Alana claims, said he didn't see this happen, stating it's obvious that she mistook someone else. Since I was with the game science team the entire time during those days, including the TGA night, no one cried over this. In fact, I didn't see anyone crying at the event. I have no idea why she said so. I was not there at the event, so I personally don't know who's right and who's wrong, but that was a whole other element that contributed to people thinking that game science are being very sore losers or not being sportsmanlike or graceful about being, you know, nominated, which alone is a big deal, and then like not winning and not, you know, handling that well is kind of how all of that was perceived. At the very least, you can see Game Science's CEO's reaction when Astrobot was announced as the winner for Game of the Year. It's this guy right here. And he doesn't look like he's crying. In fact, he's smiling and seems like he's handling it well, unless he's really good at hiding the pain or something. Though I don't know if Alana saw other developers that are not the CEO who maybe some of them were crying, or maybe she misconstrued the situation. And Charles Young, you know, he claims that he didn't see anyone from Game Science crying, so maybe he's right. I don't know. Again, I wasn't there personally. At the end of the day, look, Black Myth Wukong is still winning a lot of other awards. I think it's cool that Astrobot won. Like, these award ceremonies ultimately don't take away from the achievements of any one individual game or the enjoyment of any one individual who are fans of these games. None of it should ultimately take away from the pride that the developers and creators have in their work, or the fun that players take away from these games, or the impact that these games have on them and their perception of all of these individual games and what their favorites are. Like, none of this ultimately takes away from that. So I ultimately see no reason for any of this to get ugly. I think you're allowed to love the games that you love and have your own picks for what your game of the year is. And, you know, there are plenty of awards that all these games will ultimately win, and these games will still be deemed as among the best of this year. I think it's cool that we got a year where so many cool experiences released, and I'm just glad that I'm a gamer who gets to be able to, like, behold creations like these that are just so amazing coming from extremely talented people. That's my take, at least. Let me know in the comments below what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole Game Awards, Black Myth Wukong, Game of the Year, you know, Baldur's Gate 3, Swen Vincke / Game Science CEO, and community bickering and stuff like that. This whole situation, what your take is on all of this. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.